The great station of Orion's Gate was alive with the hum of thousands of travelers moving through its shining corridors and vast chambers of glass and steel. The air carried a mix of scents from dozens of alien cuisines and the echo of many voices blended into a steady background murmur that never truly faded. Ships from every corner of known space came and went with a steady rhythm, docking and departing as crews hurried to load cargo or prepare for their next voyage. It was a place where deals were struck and goods from far-off worlds changed hands, but it was also a place where old grudges and ancient prejudices still found their way into daily life. In the central food hall, rows of long metal tables stood under bright light panels while holographic menus hovered above serving counters. The room was a meeting point for workers, merchants, and travelers of every shape and size. Humans were common here, their language mixing with the sharp clicks or low hums of other species. But not every guest in the food hall was welcome to enjoy its comfort in the same way. Lyra moved quietly through the hall, carrying a simple tray of food in her hands. She was from a race that once ruled wide territories before losing a long and bitter war centuries ago. Since then, her people had been seen as defeated, broken, and lesser by many other species. Though the war was long past, its shadow lingered in the minds of those who wished to remember her kind only as the losers of history. Her heritage marked her in a way she could never hide: the patterns along her skin, the shape of her eyes, the soft tone of her voice, all gave away who she was, and for some that was reason enough to treat her differently. She paused near the inner tables where a group of tall, scaled workers sat eating noisily. One of them glanced up, saw her, and let out a short laugh. His voice was sharp and mocking as he told her that she should know better than to walk toward the clean tables with her dirty heritage. Several of his companions joined in, grinning as if they had shared the same joke many times before. Another pointed toward the far corner, where a narrow passage led out to the waste vents. The smell there was faint, but ever present. Was the place where certain workers took their meals, those who were considered unclean. Lyra said nothing. She had learned long ago that answering only made things worse. She turned away from the warm light of the inner tables and walked to the cold, narrow corner outside. She sat on a low bench with the hum of machinery above her and the faint hiss of recycled air blowing from the vents. Her tray rested on her lap. The sounds of laughter and chatter drifted from the hall behind her. Each voice was a reminder that she did not belong inside. She kept her eyes on her food, trying not to think about how small the space felt. The metal under her hands was cold, and the air had a dry bitterness to it. The meal itself was nothing special, but it was all she could afford. She tried to focus on the taste, on the warmth of the food, but every moment seemed to stretch longer than the last. Her shoulders tightened as the footsteps of those passing by slowed so they could glance at her before moving on. Some looked away quickly, others stared without shame. Inside the food hall, a human named Marcus had been waiting for his order at one of the counters. He noticed the exchange between Lyra and the scaled workers. He saw the way her expression shifted when they spoke to her, how she turned and walked away without a word. He watched her pass through the narrow doorway into the dim corner near the vents, and something in him twisted. He had seen things like this before, but each time it struck him with the same sharp sense of wrongness. His food arrived, but he barely noticed. Instead, he picked up his tray and walked not toward the open tables, but toward the same corner where Lyra sat. She did not see him at first, and when he sat down beside her, she stiffened as if unsure whether this was another insult in disguise. Marcus simply placed his tray on the bench and began eating without a word. His presence was quiet, but it carried a weight. The sound of voices from the hall seemed to fade, slightly replaced by the hum of the machinery around them. Lyra looked at him at last. Her voice was low when she asked why he was here. He answered simply that the inside tables did not feel right today. She understood what he meant, though he did not say it directly, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a small shift inside her chest, a feeling that was not exactly comfort, but not as heavy as the shame she had carried moments ago. Some of the scaled workers had noticed and were watching from the hall. One of them muttered something under his breath, while another shook his head. Marcus ignored them. He continued eating slowly, as if this was the most natural place to be. Lyra found herself taking smaller bites. Her attention divided between her food and the strange quiet of their shared space. Unseen by them, a small security drone drifted past, its lenses recording the scene. The station's public feed often picked up such moments and shared them with whoever cared to watch. Out there beyond the walls of the food hall, the simple act of a human sitting beside someone cast out for her heritage was about to be seen by far more eyes than either of them could imagine. The story was only beginning, and neither Lyra nor Marcus knew how far it would spread or what storms it might bring to the vast and complex life of Orion's Gate. The food hall was always busy during the station's midday break, and this day was no different. The sound of cutlery clinking against trays, the faint hum of conversations in dozens of languages, and the rich aroma of freshly cooked meals filled the space. But a shift in the air seemed to ripple through the crowd as more people began to notice the human sitting outside by the vents beside one of the so-called unclean. Lyra kept her gaze down, unsure of what to make of his decision to join her, and unsure of how much trouble this might cause for both of them. Marcus, however, seemed unaffected by the stares from the hall, his manner calm, his movements steady as he ate from his tray. From inside the hall, one of the scaled workers who had sent Lyra away leaned back in his seat, his yellow eyes narrowing as he called out toward Marcus with a sharp tone, demanding to know why a human would choose to sit in a place meant for the dishonored. His voice carried across the tables, drawing the attention of nearby diners. Marcus raised his head, slightly met the worker's gaze, and replied in an even voice that there was nothing dishonorable about sharing a meal, and that the only shame here was in the act of forcing someone to eat apart from others. The hall quieted slightly as people turned to watch the exchange. The scaled worker gave a harsh laugh, rising from his seat and stepping toward the doorway that led to the vent area, his height and bulk casting a shadow over Marcus and Lyra. He said that this was tradition, an old custom that had been honored for generations, and that outsiders had no right to interfere in the ways of other peoples. Lyra shifted uncomfortably, knowing this was the point where things could turn dangerous. Marcus, however, did not flinch. Instead, he leaned back slightly and said that a tradition which humiliates the innocent was nothing more than cruelty dressed in the clothes of the past. The scaled worker's eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment it seemed he might lash out. But other diners had begun to murmur, and a few even nodded at Marcus's words. Lyra felt her heart race. She had never seen anyone challenge this rule so openly, especially not for her sake. Her voice was quiet when she told Marcus that it was better to let it go, that speaking against it would only bring trouble. Yet he shook his head and told her that silence only made the wrong stronger. As they spoke, a small comms drone drifted into the open space just inside the hall, its sensor lights blinking as it recorded the scene. The station's network often broadcasts such moments live to public feeds, and it was not uncommon for debates, arguments, or unusual events to spread quickly across its millions of viewers. Within minutes, the exchange between Marcus and the scaled worker was being replayed on screens in shops and rest areas, and even in the docking bays of Orion's Gate. The scaled worker seemed to sense the attention turning against him, and with a final glare, he stepped back into the hall, muttering under his breath. As he returned to his table, Marcus turned to Lyra and smiled faintly, telling her that it seemed they had made the lunchtime news, though she did not quite understand how far that news might travel. She glanced toward the hall, seeing more faces turned their way, some curious, some openly hostile, and a few quietly approving. By the time Marcus finished his meal and stood to leave, a small group of humans from nearby tables had followed his example and carried their trays outside to sit near the vents beside Lyra. It was not a loud protest. There were no shouted slogans or raised fists, only a quiet, steady presence that seemed to grow with each minute. The sight was enough to make some diners uncomfortable, and enough to make others pull out their personal devices to capture the moment for themselves. Lyra was unsure how to feel. A part of her wanted to slip away before things became too large to handle. Yet another part felt something she had not felt in years, a sense that perhaps she was not entirely alone on this station. Marcus noticed her unease and told her softly that she owed him nothing, and that his choice to sit here was his alone. She nodded, but inside, she knew that whatever happened next this day had already changed something in her later. That evening, as the station lights dimmed to simulate night cycles, the public feed replayed the recording from the food hall, alongside commentary from various guests, some defending the ancient tradition, others calling it a stain on the reputation of Orion's Gate. The discussion spilled over into private channels and message boards. Humans across the station began debating whether they should follow Marcus's example, while some alien communities warned that such acts of defiance would disrupt the fragile balance of interspecies relations. The next day, Lyra arrived at her workplace, a small cargo processing office near Dock 12, only to be summoned immediately by her supervisor, a tall insectoid being whose many eyes blinked in unison as he told her that her presence in the public feed had caused unwanted attention. He warned her to keep a low profile and to avoid stirring more controversy. She tried to explain that she had not asked anyone to film her or to sit with her, but he waved off her words, reminding her that as an employee she represented the company, and that the company valued harmony above all else. Elsewhere, Marcus faced his own meeting with the human trade liaison, a stern woman who informed him that while his intentions might have been good, his actions had the potential to cause political strain with other species. She advised him to choose his battles carefully and to remember that life on Orion's Gate depended on mutual respect and compromise. Marcus listened politely, but in his mind respect did not mean accepting cruelty simply because it was wrapped in the language of culture. In the days that followed, both Marcus and Lyra found themselves the subjects of whispers in the corridors, some voices friendly, others not. Their paths crossed more often now, sometimes by accident, sometimes because Marcus would seek her out during breaks. Lyra began to understand that whatever the risks, this human's decision to stand beside her had set something in motion that neither of them could easily stop. And far above, in the central network hub of Orion's Gate, the feeds continued to replay the moment again and again, each view adding to the quiet storm that was beginning to form, one that would soon break over the polished halls and bright markets of the station. In ways no one had fully imagined, the ripple from that single meal outside the food hall spread farther than either Lyra or Marcus could have expected. As the station's cycles passed, the images and recordings traveled beyond Orion's Gate, carried on private messages and public news feeds to distant colonies and trade hubs. Reactions came quickly and in many forms. Some praised the human for his courage, while others condemned him for disrespecting the customs of another people. The debate was not only about one meal, it became about the place of tradition in a society built on so many different cultures. For Lyra, the days became heavier as she walked through the busy corridors. The glances that used to pass over her now lingered longer, some filled with sympathy, others sharp with hostility. She could hear pieces of conversations as she passed, remarks about how she had invited trouble or comments about her bravery. Though she never felt brave, the attention made her skin prickle. And each time she stepped into the food hall, she could sense the shift in the air around her. At her workplace, the pressure increased. The insectoid supervisor summoned her twice more to remind her that the company could not afford unwanted conflict with clients of other species. One afternoon, he handed her a formal notice that any further appearance in the public feed connected to acts of protest would be considered a violation of contract. Lyra signed the notice quietly, knowing there was little she could do. She had bills to pay, and her position was one of the few steady jobs her kind could find on the station. Faced a different kind of resistance. The human trade liaison sent him repeated warnings, urging him to step away. From the issue, he received polite but cold messages from certain human merchants, who feared losing alien customers if they were seen supporting him. A few friends avoided him altogether. Their absence was almost as loud as the anger of those who confronted him directly in the corridors, telling him that he was stirring up trouble for no reason. Yet Marcus could not forget the look on Lyra's face when he first sat down beside her, or the weight in her voice when she said it was better to let it go. He had seen the quiet way she endured the humiliation, and he could not accept that as the normal way of things. One evening, as Marcus walked through the market district, he noticed a group gathered around a large public display screen. The feed was replaying the original confrontation alongside new commentary from a station news panel. Representatives from several species debated the issue with sharp words. One argued that traditions should be respected no matter how they appeared. To outsiders, another countered that traditions that harmed or humiliated others should be reformed. The host mentioned that petitions were circulating both for and against the seating law, and that the station council would have to address the matter if the petitions reached a certain number of signatures. The next day, Lyra found a folded slip of paper slipped under her work tablet. It contained only a few words written in a human hand, saying that she was not alone and that more people than she knew stood with her. She suspected Marcus had left it, though she did not ask him about it. Later that shift, she overheard two of her co-workers whispering about the growing number of humans who had started to eat near the vents in quiet. Solidarity, the image of those small acts, gave her a strange mix of hope and fear, because each one increased the risk of retaliation from those who clung to the old ways. Her fears proved correct when she returned to the food hall one cycle later and found a group of scaled workers blocking the entrance to the vent area. They told her she could not eat there anymore because humans had made it into a stage for their own cause, and that if she wanted to eat, she would have to do it somewhere else entirely. The tone in their voices made it clear they were not offering her a choice. Marcus arrived moments later, carrying his own tray, and seeing the blockade step forward without hesitation. His voice was calm but firm as he told them that the seating area did not belong to them alone, and that anyone had the right to use it. The scaled workers bristled, and one took a step closer, but the presence of onlookers and a recording drone hovering nearby kept the tension from turning into open violence. That confrontation was broadcast across the feeds, just like the first, and this time the reaction was even stronger. Entire forums lit up with arguments. Some accused Marcus of provoking conflict, while others began sharing their own experiences of prejudice on the station. It was as if a dam had cracked and stories long kept in silence were beginning to spill out. Lyra read some of them late at night on her small personal device, feeling a strange kinship with strangers she had never met. Meanwhile, the petitions grew in number. One demanded the preservation of the old custom, another demanded its removal entirely. The council chambers became the center of constant speculation, as people wondered when or if the matter would be brought to an official vote. Rumors spread that certain factions were pressuring the council to delay any action until public interest faded. Marcus, however, believed that interest would not fade if enough people stood together. He began quietly speaking to other humans, encouraging them to join him at mealtimes, outside in the vent area, not with loud slogans, but with simple presence. The number of participants grew steadily each cycle, until the sight of humans eating beside Lyra or others of her heritage became common enough to draw daily attention. The tension reached into places neither Lyra nor Marcus had expected. Trade between certain human merchants and scaled traders slowed as suspicion grew. Diplomatic envoys from other stations sent polite but pointed messages asking whether Orion's Gate was still a place where all cultures were welcome. The station's security forces began to increase patrols in the food hall and surrounding corridors, citing a need to maintain order, though many suspected it was as much about monitoring protest as preventing violence. For Lyra, the pressure was becoming almost unbearable. She feared losing her job. She feared what might happen if one of the more aggressive scaled workers decided to act without witnesses. Yet she also felt a pull toward the growing movement Marcus had started. She had lived too long with the weight of silent shame, and the sight of humans willing to share her place of humiliation was slowly reshaping the way she saw herself. The quiet corner by the vents no longer felt entirely like exile. It was becoming something else, a place where a small defiance had begun to grow into something larger and harder to ignore. And somewhere deep in the council's upper chambers, unseen by most, the petitions had crossed the threshold required for official debate. The decision whether to keep or abolish the custom would soon be made, but no one knew how fiercely it would be resisted. When the time came, the station cycle turned toward the day of the interspecies gathering, a formal event held in the central dining hall, where representatives of many worlds came together to mark trade agreements and renew diplomatic ties. It was an occasion where the food hall was dressed in banners from every known faction, where tables were polished to a mirror shine and dishes from 100 kitchens were served under the bright glow of hanging lights. For most it was a day to be seen and remembered, but for Lyra, the thought of stepping into that hall filled her with a knot of dread. She knew the custom would not be set aside for such a gathering, and the humiliation of being ordered to eat outside in front of diplomats and officials would be sharper than ever. Still, her employer had ordered her attendance, insisting that all staff from their sector be present to show unity. Marcus also knew he would be there as part of the human delegation overseeing the logistics for the gathering. In the days before the event, he had seen the tension building across the station feeds. The petitions had been acknowledged by the council, but no decision had been announced. Rumors swirled that some factions planned to challenge any attempt at change openly during the gathering itself. Marcus suspected this might be the moment when the argument would break into the open. The dining hall was already crowded when Lyra arrived. She moved carefully through the shifting groups of guests, her eyes lowered, though she could feel the weight of many gazes on her. The scaled workers were there in force, wearing the formal emblems of their guild, and when they saw her, one stepped forward and blocked her path. His voice was smooth, but his words carried the same cutting edge as always, telling her she should remember her place and head for the door to the vent area before the seating began. Around them, the hum of conversation softened as people noticed the scene. Marcus saw it from across the hall and began moving toward them, his pace steady, but his expression set like stone. Lyra tried to speak softly, telling the scaled worker that she was only following her employer's order to attend, but he shook his head and pointed toward the side door. The moment felt heavy, the way the air changes before a storm. Marcus reached them before she could move any further and stepped directly between Lyra and the scaled worker. His voice was low but carried clearly enough for those nearby to hear, as he said that if she was to be seated outside, then so would he. And not only he, but every human present under his watch. The scaled worker laughed, but the sound was uneasy. Marcus turned and faced the hall, his voice rising now as he called out to the human guests. Many had seen the feed from the earlier incidents, and without hesitation, they began to rise from their seats. Some picked up their trays, others simply walked to where Marcus stood, forming a quiet line beside him. Their movement caught the attention of the station's public drones, which circled in for a better view. The scene was now live across Orion's gate, and beyond. Marcus led the way through the side door into the narrow space near the vents, and one by one the humans followed, filling the benches and standing where there was no room left. The area that had once held only a few outcasts now overflowed with people. The murmur of voices from the main hall turned into a hushed stillness as the other species looked on. The scaled worker who had started the confrontation remained at the doorway, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking toward the hovering drones, as he realized the scale of what was happening inside the vent area. Lyra stood still for a long moment, surrounded by humans who had chosen to share her exile. She felt the warmth of their presence, the steady quiet that was not pity but something deeper. The air was still heavy with The dry metallic scent of the vents, but it no longer carried the same sting. Marcus glanced at her and gave a faint nod before turning back to face the hall. Through the open doorway, they could see diplomats and traders watching the scene. Many, with unreadable expressions, news of the protest spread faster than anyone expected. Within minutes, screens across the station were showing the live feed alongside commentary. Some voices condemned the humans for breaking protocol, others hailed them as defenders of dignity. The debate that had been simmering for days was now in full flame. Lyra realized with a mix of awe and fear that this was no longer about her alone. She was only the face of something larger, a point in a long history where lines were being drawn. In the main hall, the official speeches began without them, but the empty human table stood out like a challenge. No one from the human delegation returned to their seats when the serving drones brought food to the vent area. The humans accepted it without complaint, eating in the same quiet, steady way Marcus had shown from the start. The image of polished diplomats forced to see this parallel meal played across the feeds, again and again, somewhere high above in the council chambers. Representatives were watching closely. The petitions had already pushed them toward action, but this public act before the eyes of so many left little room to delay. A vote was scheduled for the next cycle. The old custom would be either struck from the station's laws or confirmed once more, and everyone knew the decision would carry consequences far beyond the dining hall. As the gathering drew to a close, Marcus stood and spoke briefly to those who had joined him, thanking them for their presence and reminding them that change only came when people refused to accept the unacceptable. His words were not shouted, but they carried a weight that the recording drones captured perfectly. Lyra listened quietly, feeling the strange mix of fear and hope tightening in her chest. She knew the council might still choose to protect the old ways, but she also knew that even if they did, the memory of this day would not fade when the hall finally emptied and the banners came down. The images of that silent protest continued to move across the networks. They showed a corner by the vents, once meant to hide away the so-called unclean, now filled with faces from another world, willing to share the space by choice. And that image, more than any speech or argument, might be what tipped the balance when the council met. The cycle of the vote arrived with a quiet tension that seemed to stretch across every corridor of Orion's Gate. The news screens in shops and docking bays showed the council chamber from high above its circular floor, filled with the appointed representatives of the station's many peoples. Their robes and emblems reflected every color of the spectrum, each one a mark of heritage and authority. The positive ushered reflected every color of the spectrum, each one a mark of heritage and authority. Petitions had been counted, the arguments had been made both in public and in private, and now the decision could not be delayed any longer. Outside the chamber, the plaza was crowded with citizens, workers, and traders, gathered around large display panels waiting for the outcome. Lyra had taken the morning off work with her supervisor's reluctant approval. She stood at the edge of the crowd, hands clasped together, eyes fixed on the screen. Marcus was nearby, though neither spoke as they waited. The feed showed the council speaker calling for the vote first on the motion to remove the seating restriction for those of certain heritage, then on whether to make such discrimination illegal within all public spaces of the station. The votes appeared in a slow-growing tally, each mark a signal of where a delegate stood. At first the numbers were close, the green lights for change matched almost evenly by the red lights for keeping the tradition. The air in the plaza was thick with held breath. Then a delegate from one of the larger trade factions shifted his vote to green, and another followed, and then another, as if a silent agreement had passed between them. The tide began to turn until the green lights outnumbered the red by a margin too wide to contest. The council speaker declared the motion passed. The old custom was struck down, effective immediately. The plaza erupted into a mix of cheers and gasps. Some shouted in triumph, while others muttered about the death of tradition. Lyra felt the breath she had been holding leave her in a rush, and for the first time in her life on Orion's Gate, she felt the weight on her shoulders lift even if only slightly. Marcus glanced at her with a small smile that carried more meaning than words could manage. The crowd began to thin as people hurried to share the news with friends and colleagues, but Lyra remained for a while, letting the moment settle into her bones. Later that day, she walked toward the food hall with no particular plan except to see it with her own eyes. Under the new law, the entrance was busy as usual, but something felt different. The glances she received still held curiosity, but not the same open scorn she had known before. Inside, the long tables were filled with the usual mix of species talking and eating without pause. The space near the vents stood empty, a reminder of what it had been for so long. She carried her tray not toward the side door, but to the center of the hall where a table stood open. Marcus was already there, waiting, his tray in front of him. She set her food down and took a seat across from him. Act was simple, but it felt like crossing an invisible barrier that had been there all her life. She noticed a few heads turned toward them, but no one spoke, no one told her to move. The hum of conversation continued around them, as if the hall had already begun to fold this new reality into its rhythm. Marcus asked how it felt, and she told him quietly that it felt strange and right at the same time. He nodded and said that change often did. The days that followed brought more adjustments. Scaled workers no longer had the protection of law to enforce the old seating rule, though some still chose to avoid sharing a table with her kind. Others, however, seemed to take the council's decision as permission to act differently. A young worker from another alien species approached Lyra one afternoon and asked if he could sit with her. His tone carried no pity, only the casual ease of someone seeking company. She agreed, and they ate together, speaking of ordinary things, and for Lyra, that ordinary conversation felt almost extraordinary. Across the station feeds, images from the day of the protest continued to circulate. Some showed the narrow vent area filled with humans, others captured the moment the council vote passed. Marcus's name was mentioned often, though he avoided the attention whenever possible. For him, the victory was not about recognition, but about the principle that had driven him from the start. He continued his work as before, but his presence in the food hall often drew others to join his table regardless of species. One evening, Lyra found herself walking alone through the quiet corridors of the station night cycle. The artificial lights were dimmed to a soft glow, and a distant hum of engines filled the silence. She thought about the long path from that first day by the vents to the seat she now claimed without challenge. She knew the prejudice that had shaped her life would not vanish overnight. The looks, the whispers, the memories would linger. Yet she also knew something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. The law had changed. The image of humans standing beside her had been broadcast to countless worlds, and somewhere in that vast spread of space, someone else might see it and feel less alone. She returned to the food hall the next cycle and chose a table near the center again. Marcus joined her as he often did, and soon others filled the seats around them. The hum of voices rose, and the air carried the scent of many kitchens blending together into something warm and welcoming. Lyra looked across the hall and saw the empty space near the vents, still clean and silent. It was no longer a place for shame, and that absence felt like its own quiet victory. Marcus noticed her glance and said softly that the fight had been worth it. She agreed, and for a moment, they simply sat in the steady rhythm of the hall, two people among many, yet bound by the memory of what had been and what they had changed. In the great turning of Orion's gate, it was only a small shift, but for those who had lived under the shadow of the old ways, it was the first light of a new day. And so life moved on, not in a sudden blaze of transformation, but in the slow, steady way that real change often comes through the courage to stand beside another, through the refusal to look away, and through the quiet power of ordinary acts done in the face of injustice. The hum of the station continued. The ships came and went, and the tables of the food hall filled and emptied in endless cycles. But in the center of it all, a place once closed had opened, and in that simple truth, the future held a little more space for dignity. The end.